Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, Scott, and this is my co-host, Caleb. Caleb, it's been a couple of weeks. How are you?
Good. Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. We are back again to talk about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to some old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up during that era. Caleb, we don't have a guest today. We've been on vacation a couple weeks. What do you want to talk about?
I was thinking we could discuss Oreo flavors. They've got so many now. I figured it could keep us busy for a while.
Yes, all the topic all the kids want to hear about.
Hi, this is Caleb, the producer of the show, just breaking in like I do every episode to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this show may not actually be held or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead let people share how they feel. We also know that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remembered the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show. Exactly. They want two 45-year-old men to talk about Oreo flavors.
Mm-hmm.
I know politics is a hot button issue, but I thought it'd be interesting maybe at some point to talk about the idea of not just politics, but really how we felt politics were portrayed and kind of came through specifically in our youth group experience. Not necessarily where we're at today, but just kind of some of those seeds of politics that we kind of experienced in our youth group experience. I said experience twice there in that sentence.
Yeah.
English is my first language.
And we're too cheap and too tired to re-record, so that's what the audience gets.
Totally.
So, no, I think you're right. We could do, and there's probably hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of podcasts at this point about the current state of politics and how that has transformed. Maybe we'll get there. That's come through in some of our interviews, but thought that let's talk about how we experienced that in the 90s, because it's a pretty formative time and there was a lot of stuff happening in the background at that time that kind of filtered down to us. And to be quite honest with you, I think part of me feels, and I think part of you feels too, like we kind of dodged a little bit of a bullet because the youth group wasn't super political. And I wonder how much a function of that is growing up in a northern state, particularly a blue state like Minnesota. Was it more or less than what someone in the South state might have experienced in the 90s? So, I don't know about you, but was it overtly political? Not really. But was it subvertly political? Yeah. And I think that's kind of where we can trace things back to, is where were some of the hints, stories, implications of doing the little things and how that affected politics and culture in the 90s.
I think that idea, that distinction between overtly and not overtly, is a really good one, because I'll be honest, I was raised by not very, but my parents have always been liberal. Sorry to out your mom and dad, but they've always been liberal. And so because I was raised by two ex-hippies who, still had kind of some of those beliefs. And at no point did I feel politically opposed in a youth group setting. I don't feel like I ever felt that way, where I don't know if that would be true today. And I know we're trying to avoid today, but when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, that kind of rings true, that I was raised in a family that was definitely more liberal. My parents were more liberal, yet I don't ever feel like I was called out for that in a youth group setting that I can remember. It's possible I've blocked it out of my mind out of, sheer embarrassment, but I don't.
I think that, again, maybe living where we're at, that might not happen as much anymore. Or that might not happen where we're at, excuse me, in a northern state. But maybe somebody listening somewhere else is like, dude, if my kids told my youth pastor that I voted for Biden or whatever. They might lose their mind, and I think that's a real risk. And so I don't want to underscore the risk of someone not feeling comfortable to say I don't agree with certain parts of your political platform because I think we've talked about in past episodes there's really no nuance anymore. It's all arguments,
Yeah.
it's all angertainment. Then that's what the news is. And
Ooh, I like that. I've never heard that phrase, angertainment.
I did not make it up, but I will use it excessively. um, but that's what it all is, and it really creates a whole us versus them. We're enemies. We're on the opposite side. I had the opposite experience as you. My parents were and still are conservative, and I'm not. But I can distinctly remember that we lived overseas when Clinton got elected, and I can distinctly remember one of my parents crying about it because they were not happy. And all I remember is that I went onto the bus that morning and I was angry because I saw my parents upset, but
Hmm.
I didn't know why. So
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
I can't, and I was not living in the country at the time, but that's kind of where I came from. So coming into youth group and having kind of this message of you are different and what you do in culture matters and you can influence culture for good was kind of the subvert political message that I got, which was again, which was the things that you do can influence future decisions that are being
Hmm.
made down the road. And so there was kind of a responsibility on it, but there was never antagonism. There was never like the other side, at least in the youth group, the other side is the enemy. That we might have said they're misguided or they got the wrong ideas that we disagree with. But I personally, at least up until 1998, didn't feel any sort of us versus them mentality.
Yeah. I don't even remember. I was trying to think of, was it ever even mentioned? And I can think of one example of one youth leader who I do believe shared some political commentary and that it was conservative was the way to go. Now that I'm thinking through it, I can think of that. And there might have been some one off conversations, but I feel like even some of those were when I was older and maybe was back visiting my parents when they were still at Five Oaks and I was coming back from college. But I can remember one distinct youth leader who did kind of make comment. I used to babysit for them, so it may have not even been in a youth group setting. It may have been in a
Mm.
in more of a social setting. So that's the only time I can remember it really being overt. I think you're totally right that it was more subversive. And I'm trying to think. It's funny that you can come up with even a subversive thing, and I don't even know if I can.
Can I ask you, like, did your parents ever talk about feeling like they couldn't talk about it, or they were kind of part of the outside? Because, right, they're growing up in the 70s and 80s, so they're absorbing what was going on during that time, and then they get to a church that they like, but they may not feel completely, you know, lined up that way. Did you ever hear them say that they felt like they were on the outside a little bit?
I know that they did feel it occasionally. And my mom has told a story that they were in a room. It was a social event, and I think it was Five Oaks people. It was at somebody's who went to Five Oaks' house. So it was in that church setting. I know they've definitely experienced it since then, but there was a comment made about if you vote a certain way, essentially you're a baby killer. That sort of comment, and I think my mom, who had enough, said, "I guess I'm a baby killer." And I think it kind of shut the room down because it was all of a sudden this like, oh, you're talking about people. It was never talked about a ton though. I don't feel like my parents felt that way. I just don't think there was the aggressiveness in the
Hmm.
conversation. So I think my parents were, I think it was, people didn't think it was that big of a deal. My mom worked in education and, that's gonna lean left occasionally because that's the stereotype, but that is
Hmm.
generally what's going to happen. And so like, yeah, I don't think they ever felt outcast. I know it caused some, there have been times, and I know since then there's been a number of times. My my parents have felt at times very, they have struggled very hard because they went to Bethlehem for a time after I had gone to Bethlehem. And I know they've had that tension, but I don't remember it at all in high school that it was
Hmm.
like a point of contention for
Hmm.
them.
Yeah, I think they maybe through the lens of a kid during that stage, there was a lot of, the battle for the morality of a generation was kind of heaped on the shoulders of our parents. And I think there was a lot of assumption that, and I think there's a lot of assumption now too, like get your kids in youth group, they're going to understand that the proper moral stance is this, therefore you vote on your morality. I do
Hmm.
remember that very specifically.
Yeah.
Like you vote on your morality, and the morals are important, right? Clinton wasn't a family guy; he was a cheater. All this stuff. We are the party of family values. That's the word I'm looking for, right? So that we're reserving current commentary for another episode, but that was a very very big deal, and I think that pairs very well what with what the church did during that time, which is try to instill values in your kids that are
Hmm.
Christian, quote unquote Christian, and therefore that translates into how you vote. Um, and that translation just did not occur for more people than they think. And, part of the reason, we want to have these conversations is like, if you've never heard it before, you need affirmation again, reaffirmation that it's okay to vote one way or the other. And you might feel rejected because of it. Like, do it, just vote. Like, not to get too political there, but like, that's a big deal. That's a freedom that you have that
Hmm.
we shouldn't be ashamed of. So, but I think there was this idea that like, we're going to teach them this morality, they're going to come up and believe it, and that's going to translate exactly to a vote for the conservative party no matter what. And that's just, of course, that's changed drastically in the last 8 years.
Yeah. I do feel like maybe the idea of like a one issue voter and pro life, pro choice is the one that's often. Do you remember ever hearing that in high school? I feel like I did.
Oh yeah, I very distinctly, I can't separate between what I heard in my home life and then what I
Sure.
remember hearing at youth group. But absolutely, abortion was a major issue, and it was, I would say, the main issue, right? Of
Hmm.
how to, how what morals should guide our vote. It's
Yeah.
that one for sure. Number one. Second is, and this was a little bit more on the horizon because it wasn't quite there yet, but it was affirmation. Well, at that point, it wasn't even LGBTQ. It was affirmation just of gay relationships
Yeah.
and gay marriage specifically, as if whatever else was happening to marriages at that point with all the stuff that will and does happen to marriages, homosexual or heterosexual, is biblical. But like, what I mean is that was like, hey, abortion first, gay marriage second, because that's coming.
Hmm.
And everyone was I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people were really really afraid of that. Like if that changes, the culture has officially been kicked off the cliff and we're never coming back. So those are the two I
Interesting.
distinctly remember. I will tell you that part of my, I think it was part of my Masters of Theology projects. I can't remember if it was for that or just because I was volunteering at the church, but for a time, the church and all this, the church had a stance that all the small groups in the church were going to study the same study that they put together. And it was kind of
Hmm.
this issue like, oh, this group wants to do their own thing. And, they're like, no, you should, we want you to study this. And I think the purpose was good, which was let's follow along all together at the same time on same topics. We're talking about the same
Yeah.
thing. Problem is they didn't really have the capacity to have one of the pastors write it or anything
Hmm.
like that. So you would get volunteers to write it, and they weren't necessarily terrible, but sometimes they weren't as super effective. The questions weren't great. That's a hard thing to do.
Sure.
Um, I had the chance to write, I don't know, three or four of those,
Hmm.
and specifically, I can't remember if the subject was sexuality or not, but I do remember part of the questions kind of filtering into how do we love people who are in that lifestyle and the way my questions kind of unfolded was, hey, if you how does it actually look to love somebody, because a lot of people who are there in that lifestyle or have that sexuality don't feel loved,
Sure.
because it's, I'm going to love you, but I'm going to tell you that you're sinning all the time, and the way
Sure.
that you were born or whatever it is, I shouldn't say or whatever, but the way that you were born, the way that your sexuality lines up with everyone else, if it doesn't line up with the heterosexual model, you're a sinner until you change it. You can't change
Sure.
it, in my opinion. But like, I had kind of formulated it like, should we just be loving them and let God do the work, or should we be trying to change them?
Hmm.
And that was the kind of the question. And again, I don't remember the rest of the context. And I distinctly remember after that came out and they let it go through. It's not like they just printed it. The pastors
Sure.
were reviewing it. I had multiple, like I shouldn't say like I wasn't like 20 or 30. It was like, but it was a handful of adults, not just kids, or youths or whatever. Adults coming up and be like, hey, and it's like a whisper because they don't want to, hey, thanks for talking about that and and asking those questions. It's important to think about it that way. And I was like, oh,
Sure.
okay, well, there's other people here who might think that it's have a different, more evolved, progressive view of that they don't feel comfortable talking about.
Yeah.
And that told me again that the way that was talked about in the church, even though again I don't think it was super antagonistic, the way that you experience it in a lot of places today, but it was very, I would still say anti-gay in
Sure.
many ways. So I distinctly remember that experience of being complimented. I'm like, oh, okay, well, people might have different opinions on it. So
Yeah. Interesting.
so that kind of was like that kind of evolved for the 5-6 years that I was there. But yeah, for sure, abortion and home and gay marriage. If when those two things change, abortion was already legal, but if and when gay marriage becomes illegal, forget about it. The youth are
Becomes legal.
done.
Yeah.
No one's coming back. We can't save them from that kind of stuff. As if Christ and God Himself can't overcome that.
That's really interesting because that's a couple years after youth group though, because right, that's when that's when you're done with high school and you're working at you because you were doing like an internship at the church,
Yeah, I did
right?
an internship at the
Okay.
church for my master's. Yeah.
So I definitely remember. I don't remember gay marriage ever. And again, I'm unique apparently because everybody we've talked to, I'm the weird one because I left right after high school, took off and never came back. That's not true. I came back, but it was I didn't come back and work. I'm like the only one who didn't serve in the youth group afterwards, and there's some reasons that happened, but like I didn't. I do not remember gay marriage being talked about at Five Oaks.
Hmm.
I do remember the idea of homosexuality being talked about at Five Oaks, and I will say it was antagonistic. And I won't go into the details, but it was antagonistic.
Mm-hmm.
It was not, it was described as like repulsive and like,
Okay.
this is horrible. And I remember the word gross being thrown around.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I do think it was antagonistic, but it wasn't specifically to just gay marriage. It was just to homosexuality in general.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, so I do remember that, but I don't remember gay marriage, like, to get to, like, a real political issue specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that. And I do, I mean, man, I think about this often, like, that phrase, like, hate the sin, love the sinner. And, like, how even now, like, people like even that phrase has become like a loaded phrase because I do remember
Of
that
course.
being taught, and I do still think if we actually did that, like if Christians actually did that, hate's the wrong word, but if we did actually truly love the sinners around us, me being the foremost of those people who we need to love. Love me, people. Love me. I just
We'll
feel
get
like
there.
what a difference it would make. And so like I think it's kind of that message of love the sinner, hate the sin, or however you want. And again, hate's a bad word because it really does taint it.
But it was the word.
It was the word though, yes, and that's why that phrase feels loaded. It was just really hard to talk about it in such antagonistic. It's a really good word, I think. Antagonistic manner, but then turn around and be like, but love the sinner, and so like it did muddy the waters quite a bit. I think whether intentional or not, I feel like it did. And again, that wasn't to a necessarily to a political like. I don't remember gay marriage being talked about at all, but that could be me. But I do remember the topic of homosexuality being a hot button topic that we talked about.
I, I'll I'll elaborate on this comment later when we have maybe a discussion about current state of evangelicalism and what we like and what we don't like about it. But like that phrase, which is interesting, you bring up, hate the sin, love the sinner, very very loaded with, I would say, a lack of responsibility on the Christian's part.
Hmm.
So, and this is a theme I've been noticing quite a bit just in my own analysis of everything and thought process. But to hate the sin is to vote against, somebody's freedom to marry who they love. And to hate the sin is to tell them you're going to hell because of your sexuality. To love the sinner means to say, I love you.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean anything. There's no weight, there's no responsibility of the Christian to the other person in that context. And
Hmm.
and again, I'll elaborate that on more, but that's just one example of that where I can say I love somebody and that's all I have to do.
Sure.
And I'm simplifying it, I know, and again, I'll elaborate on it, but like that was the phrase, right? And hate was the operative word.
Yeah.
And it was the word specifically being used because it's way easier to hate somebody and it's way harder to love somebody.
Hmm.
And I just feel for those people who are growing up in those contexts, and now you see so much of that changing and people kind of owning who they are. And yeah, I get it, it feels uncomfortable for people, but look, people of any identity, gender identity, whatever, they've been around for, I shouldn't say whatever, I apologize to the audience, I'm trying to make this as quick as possible, but they've been around forever. They just haven't had the space to be themselves.
Hmm.
And so, and youth group was definitely that way. I won't name any names, but I can remember at least one kid who, if I didn't know it then, I certainly know that kid was absolutely gay. I'll put money on it. And we just didn't have a space for him to come out
Hmm.
and be himself because that hate the sin, love the sinner in terms of sexuality, there's no room for that.
Right.
And what would we know? We're two hetero dudes, and it doesn't really affect us. We have a privilege in that regard. But there was the love part was so much harder to do, and it was just easier to forget about it. And it makes me sad thinking about it.
It would have been interesting to see how that. I mean, how would have a church in the '90s handled that sort of thing? Because so you got to put it in the context of all the parents. Like even if you would have had like it's a conservative church. I don't think it's that conservative a church. I
No.
went to a conservative church for a while.
Yes.
So it's not a crazy conservative church, but I still think if you would have had a kid come out in the '90s and the youth group setting would have just said no big deal, I think you would have had parents pulling kids, don't you think?
Oh
You would
yes,
have had
100%.
so I mean it's a really weird spot to be in because the culture at that time. I mean, even today, I think if we had a kid come out at our youth group at the church I go to, I and the church just said that's fine, no big deal. I think we'd be losing families left and right.
Same. Yep.
So it's an interesting thing to think about, like how could you have even made that space available to somebody just to let them be, and
In terms of the politics of it all, then it was just like, hey, we need to get these. And I remember a little bit in the leadership training part of it too, right? In other interviews we've talked about, how there was some intense leadership development, as most youth groups are wont to do. They're going to try and develop kids into leaders. Part of that is, hey, you're going to go change the world this way. And I can remember not a whole bunch, but there was a distinct like, if we can get these kids into politics and help them change the laws, then we're going to become, quote, a more moral nation. And there's a
Hmm.
whole, we can talk about the theology of that, specifically how there's far more verses of other types of moral in the Bible that are
Right.
difficult to institute politically because it would cause everybody to sacrifice what they have. But I am just sad for a lot of those people who are stuck there for a long time, and a lot of people who are still stuck because of that experience. There's probably plenty of people out there who still don't know what to do with that part of them because it was shut up for so long and shamed for so long. So again, I do think that there was a angle of, hey, if you want to be a good Christian in the world, you're going to kind of influence people to vote this way because
Hmm.
if again, it was a culture war and that hasn't gone away, but if the culture goes this way, then just forget about it.
Sure. It's interesting because like I don't. Maybe I was head in the sand about some things, but like, and maybe it was the influence of my parents because like I don't remember the doom and gloom very much. Like the whole like if this happens, then the culture goes down. You know, like I just don't remember that as much. And again, I'm wondering how much of it was the family I was brought up in, where we just didn't have that mentality. And
Hmm.
so even if I heard it at church or at youth group, I translated it to like, oh yeah, we don't want the culture, like we don't want people to be, we want people to love God. It wasn't about like, oh, the culture's going to crap. We want people, so like I just, even the way I interpreted it when it came out in a youth group setting was just not a doom and gloom, the society's going
Hmm.
to hell because Clinton got elected, because that just wasn't a theme in my house growing up. I just don't think it was. And so I wonder how much of even that, just my interpretation of subversive political messages at youth group, was it went over my head. We've established I'm not that bright. So that could also be it too, but I don't remember that. I don't remember that feeling of doom and gloom,
Hmm.
which is just really interesting to me, that I just missed it.
It's there and it's only gotten worse.
I know. Oh yeah, I know. Let's be real clear. Now I see it. I mean, if we're gonna talk about today, I see it, and I have to.
That's part two.
Yeah, yeah. That's a whole other discussion. And how do you deal with your kids with it? That's a
Hmm.
really interesting one.
Yeah.
How do you not alienate your kids at a youth group setting?
Yeah.
So So even as we're talking, I've been thinking, oh, it wasn't that big deal. It wasn't that blatant. But I will say, as we've been talking, I do remember the concept of one issue voting, and
Mm,
that's really the right way to do it,
yes.
coming up. Now, I don't know if it ever came up on a Wednesday, maybe not, but in some of those leadership trainings or in some more one-on-one conversations, I do remember knowing that youth group leaders were one issue voters, and that was a thing. And I don't want to go into names or anything, but I do remember that. Now that I think about it, one issue voter was not something I stumbled into post college. And so I do remember that now, but I don't know if it ever came on a Wednesday, and that could be me also misremembering, but I do now kind of remember that we did talk about that.
That's an interesting point about it all, which kind of goes back to what I was saying before by lack of responsibility. The what issue being abortion, of course,
Mm,
and that was the only thing that mattered.
yeah.
And obviously now that's a big deal.
Yeah.
um, and it kind of holds the weight of like what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for. You know,
Mm,
on a political side, what are we responsible for? Well, we're responsible for a baby being born, and then that's about it. But is that truly a biblical message?
mm,
But it was a message co-opted by politics, filtered into the church, that made our way down to us by way of conservative leadership. So it certainly was not something that our church or any church made up. It was a political buy-in. It was the purchase price for the conservative vote,
Right.
and it became and that's all they needed. We can just get them upset about this one issue. That's all they need, and it
Yeah.
worked.
Yep. I don't remember my parents freaking out, so I must not have gone home and talked about it. Because I think my parents would. I don't know. My parents are not freak out parents, so
No, they're not.
maybe they would have never freaked out about it. But I don't know. So yeah, that was interesting. As we were thinking, like it feels like there's like every time we do this, we talk, and I just feel like the onion gets peeled back a little. And I'm like, oh yeah,
Hmm.
oh yeah. So I did want to mention though there was one other area or
Oh,
one other thing that really did permeate where I really started to experience politics,
oh,
and that was
do
hold on.
tell. For the listener at home, Caleb is pulling something out visually as a prop.
Yeah, this isn't going to work for the listener at home, but it was this. So I'm
Oh,
holding up.
yeah.
All conversations for me lead back to Five Iron Frenzy,
Yes,
but
yes.
it was. I remember, and I'm going to read it real quick because it was their first album, the first song on
Yep.
the first album. They had this little thing, and I'll try and read it quick, but it's like,
So for the audience, Caleb held up the
yeah.
vinyl album cover of Upbeats and Beatdowns, Five Iron Frenzy's very first album.
And their first song is the song Old West, and Reese is the lead singer of Five Iron Frenzy, was forced to put in the notes. He wasn't forced, but their record company said, "No, we want you to do the song. It's interesting, but you probably want to put something in there just so people aren't totally taken back because the lyrics to the song are pretty intense." But it's up until the middle of the 20th century, many Americans believed in an idea known as manifest destiny. It held that all of North America, from sea to shining sea, was rightfully the property of the U.S. and was given to us by God. Native Americans were unscrupulously, I'm good at English, thrown off of their homelands and slaughtered in the name of Jesus. Horror stories of entire tribes being led through rivers while being baptized just to be shot and scalped on the other side rivals those of the Spanish Inquisition. And he goes on, and the lyrics from the song are, West or bust, in God we trust, let's rape and kill and steal. We can almost justify anything we feel. I'm climbing up the ladder, more brownie points for me. I'll work my way to Jesus. Just you wait and see. And so that for me was the first time that conservative politics was really challenged, was actually through Five Iron Frenzy. And
Hmm.
some of the lyrics on this album, on the second album, they had a song called Banner Year, which was also
Yep.
about Indian,
Great song.
Native American issues. I think probably their most underrated song. And then on their third album, they had the song Riot Gear, where,
Yep.
that was specifically about the Denver Police Department, and kind of the riots that happened after the Super Bowl. But I mean, that idea that the riots were not caused by rioters, they were caused by the people who came in and shot tear gas into the crowd. That's what stirred up the crowd to violence. It wasn't the crowd, it was the people who came in and shot tear gas into them, which was the police. And they've become more political in a lot of ways, their last album specifically. But I will say that was a strong introduction to me of not conservative politics, was actually Five Iron Frenzy. So not to bring all conversations back to Five Iron Frenzy, but it is interesting to look back and the little things that they talked about as a band that really have hung with me for sure. Obviously, as they have hung with me uh, quite obsessively, because I've got problems.
I hope we don't have to pay them money for you reading the lyrics. Second, what year was that? 96?
I want to say 97.
97. So,
Oh no, 96. It was late 96.
see, I'm a bigger Five Iron fan than you, but
I,
um,
I will challenge you to that.
yes, you will. But it's a great point you bring up because, like, I distinctly remember hearing that and be like, "Yeah, what the hell, dude? Like,
Yeah,
why was this ever okay?" And also too, why don't we talk about it?
yeah,
Like the combination of politics and look, right now it's heavily right wing politics. I get that. There is far less evidence of religion influencing left wing politics, at least in this country, although that's not the case for every country. But it's that's part of our history, dude. Like, why can't we talk about that? And why
yeah,
can't we identify why those messages of the church should influence politics, why is that kind of something that we've backed off from? And it's almost
Hmm.
a now it's almost like again a a subversive in the other way commentary to make that about politics, because you either should support or you're against Christianity. And it got there because of the slow influence of one issue voting,
Yeah.
or
Yep.
a record label, 5 Minute Walk being a pretty good record label for all intents and purposes, for all we know, saying, hey, you have these lyrics. Why don't you put at least an explanation so people don't get pissed off? Like, what are we doing?
Right.
Why can't we address that? And it's because, in some regard, like, we want to maintain a power that gives us because we think that's freedom to practice
Yeah.
religion. Now, I'm going to get down a road we shouldn't go because
No,
we've
no. I
gotten too
mean,
long. We got to go to part two later.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Very good.
Yeah. And Anthem was on that album too. I mean, that's a song that specifically speaks to the idea that you make an idol out of American life, and
Hmm.
so there's a number of things, but I remember that. And then there was the song Handshake by Black Eyed Siva, which
Yeah,
was another kind of pushing in on, at least push it, it wasn't overtly political, but I mean, so it's interesting to think about. And obviously I'm pretty obsessed with music still, but like it's interesting to think that music had an influence too, and that was where we started to see, because I can think of a couple other bands that
yeah.
had minor political commentary. I think Poor Old Lou had a song that I can still, maybe they didn't mean it
Stave
that way, the
Saker
way I read the
probably.
lyrics now.
Yeah,
Stave Saker,
yeah.
and just I don't know, some of those bands. Five Iron was a big one for me. There's a joke that goes around on social media all the time, that isn't it interesting that 90s youth group kids were taught about Native American issues by a ska band from Denver, because
Right,
I think that's where it came up
right,
for a lot of us,
right.
So
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, we would never talk about Christian political history and youth group. That's just not a thing. Like,
Yeah.
why not? Well, because if we learned about that history, it might tell us, hey, we maybe shouldn't partake in the combination of Christianity and politics as much. And
Yeah.
that's a threat. So we need them to vote a certain way. So let's kind of back off.
Yeah.
Very general comment I just made, I get. But like, yeah, I mean, even to, my favorite, we're going to get to a 5 hour analysis now, but, on there, on, whatever I'm not a biggest Fire Iron fan. I can't remember the title of the album, but Zen and the Art of Xenophobia. Immediately when I heard that song, I was like, I
Yeah.
need to memorize these lyrics. And it turns out they make a music video with Jesus busting out of the tomb, shooting machine guns or Uzis or whatever. And it was like, yep,
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
That's
It's off Engine of a Million Plots. Came out
sorry.
in
Yes.
2013. You should, if you have not listened to that, if you were a Five Iron Frenzy fan in high school and you have not listened to their two most recent albums,
Shame on
you
you.
should.
Yeah.
They are fantastic. That song in particular is them. I mean, Reese legitimately said, he's like, yeah, all of a sudden we realized we didn't have a record label and we didn't have to sell this in Christian bookstores because they don't exist anymore.
Hmm.
We just didn't have to worry about it, so I was able to just say what was a lot more on my mind. But yeah.
This has been fun. We got on a few tangents, as we probably will do from here on out. We appreciate you listening to us. And look, if this sparked something in you and you want to talk about it, we'd be very, very happy to hear you and converse with you. So, Caleb, where can they find us on Twitter? They can email us, right? I'm the host and I don't know this stuff.
Yeah, and I don't have the script up. You can. Oh, I
We
can
don't have
edit
a
this. Hang on.
script. There's no script.
Yeah, you can find us on Twitter at SurvivedYG. It's at SurvivedYG. I try and tweet occasionally, although it's mostly nonsense. But hit us up if you're interested in talking more about this, and then you can always email at us at ISurvivedYouthGroup at gmail.com. You can do that, or if you know one of us on Twitter, if you can find us on Twitter, both of our handles are on there. You can probably direct DM us, and yeah, we'd love to have somebody on to talk more about this, especially if you have things that we'd love to have anybody on. No, we'll take it. But yeah, so those are two ways to reach out if you want to talk more about it. If you want to talk more about Five Iron, you can come join my other show because I'll
That's
do
true.
that too.
You should
Yeah.
have the Earth's #1 5 iron fan myself on your podcast, on your music podcast.
In my Twitter handle, I literally have Five Iron Frenzy historian in my bio.
You nerd.
I don't even think it's nerd. It's a whole other level of problem, is what it is. Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. The music at the beginning and the end of the show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. I know we touched on some of this stuff at the end of the show, but I did want to reiterate that you can reach out to us. You can find us and let us know what you thought about this show or any of the other shows we have done. Again, you can find us on Twitter at the handle @SurvivedYG. You can also email us at ISurvivedYouthGroup@gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, drop us a line, find us on Twitter, let us know. We'd love to have you. So please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're so inclined, leave a rating or review. If you enjoyed this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. We've had a couple different formats on the show, but it's a chance to talk about some of the music I've documented and share from my calendar. Once again, it's called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon.
You behind the curtain.
All right.
You're looking at the same document I am, and it's not on there.
It is. It's at the bottom.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. I'll count myself. No, you count me in.
Okay. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, you can find us. Oh my gosh. Do it again.
3, 2, 1. Your parents and your sister are like, hey, if you got to go on the podcast, have an intervention. So that's what I'm trying to get on.
Oh, I see. Yes. I just feel bad for my kids because I'm gonna die in this house. Like, Lord willing, I never move, and they're gonna have to clean up this crap. Dad, we have 2,000 Batman comics. What are we supposed to do with these? I don't know. Fire.